Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on using quotes effectively. We're going to talk about how to get information from your secondary sources integrated into your essay, your original essay, as effectively as possible in such a way that your argument continues to flow and that the secondary source material that you are including as support for your argument helps the argument as opposed to disrupting your argument. In other words, becoming roadblocks or speed bumps that your reader trips over. And we're going to do that using the TSC method. So what is the TSC method? What does that stand for? So the TSC method stands for translate, synthesize, and connect. When we include secondary source material into our essay, we need to translate it for our reader. Now, oftentimes as authors, we include these quotes and these examples from external sources because we understand that they in some way actually support our argument and that the original author agrees with us in some way or another. However, that is not always obvious to the reader because they don't have the benefit of the context, the original context from which you are drawing this quote. And when you pull a quote out of its original source material and include it in your own essay, because the context changes, the language changes and the meaning changes. And so your job as the person writing the essay needs to translate that quote for your reader. In other words, you need to explain what is being said and why you think it's being said that way. The next thing you need to do is synthesize, right? You need to figure out how the quote works within your argument. The quote should further your paragraph's main idea and your thesis. So what you're ultimately doing is focusing on what the text does for your argument specifically. So translate, tell your reader what they're reading. You need to sort of tell them why they're reading it. And then you need to connect your synthesis to the significance and the answer to the so what question of the main paragraph. In other words, why is this here? Expand, explore, and question the larger implications of your argument. In other words, this is focusing on how this information relates to your audience and or society at large. You can think of it very similar to axes. Now, if you remember, axes has an assertion, an example, an explanation, and a significance. And the TSC is sort of a more abstract version of that and is focused more specifically on what happens after you include your example, right? So it's ignoring the assertion, it's assuming you have an assertion, and it's really focused on what do we do with that example specifically. So how do we put TSC to work? It's one thing to sort of talk about these terms like translate and synthesize and connect and give these sort of broad definitions. It's another thing entirely to put it into practice. So we're going to try applying the technique to a sample student paragraph. And hopefully in doing this exercise, you'll see how this can apply to your writing as well. So let's start with this very typical student paragraph. And it reads, "Sex is one of the most prominent features in today's advertisements. Even when it comes to selling items like food or candy, advertising has become little more than pornographic scenes in some cases and dirty jokes in others. Kilborn emphasizes the destructive attitude put forth by advertising. She offers a clear explanation as to why ads can be classified as pornographic. To wit, sex in advertising is pornographic because it dehumanizes and objectifies people, especially women, and because it fetishizes products and imbues them with an erotic charge." Now, this is very typical of a first-year essay paragraph. I can't tell you how many times I've read a paragraph just like this. And it feels very much half-finished, especially from my point of view as an instructor. So if we were to look at this from an axis point of view, we have an assertion and we have an example, right? So sex is one of the most prominent features in today's advertisements, even when it comes to selling items like food or candy. So there's our assertion, right? And then everything in the quotation marks is an example. Now, one thing that this particular author has done well with their essay is they have introduced the quote. That's something that sometimes students neglect. They'll just copy paste a quote into their paper and sort of wash their hands of it and be done. Ideally, what you want to do is explain to your readers, where did this quote come from? Who originally wrote or spoke? Right? Because we're trying to leverage logos and ethos. Now, Kilborn is well known for her academics and her scholarship on the ways in which advertising objectifies and minimizes women. and she's done 4 or 5 iterations of a presentation called Killing Us Softly, which is well worth taking the time to watch. So this writer has included not only Kilborn's quote, but introduced the quote saying Kilborn writes. So they're borrowing Kilborn's credibility about this topic in supporting their assertion. But the problem is, even by Axie's standards, this is an incomplete paragraph. There's no explanation for the quote, and we have no sense of significance. So how do we get there? How do we get from this assertion with an example to a more complete paragraph? Well, we do so, if it isn't already obvious, by applying by applying TSC, right? So the first thing we need to do with TSC is we need to translate the text, okay? So this is what happens if we take just the quote and we try and translate it for a reader to sort of break apart what it is Kilborn is trying to say in this relatively brief sentence. And our author of this paragraph writes, Kilborn clearly points out that not only do we see pornographic images in advertising, and that is pornographic not necessarily because of sexuality, but because of the dehumanization of women, but there is a slightly more subtle aspect of sexuality and objectification. Not only are women turned into objects, but objects and products are turned into something sexual. Okay, so this is great. What I really like about this is that it expands on Kilborn's original idea and it tries to articulate the subtext of Kilborn's statement, right? So Kilborn's original statement says this is pornographic because of the dehumanization and objectification of people, right? And then the sense of creating or imbuing something with a sexual charge. Okay, so what the author is doing then is restating Kilborn's point, but maybe in more plain language. And I really like the parenthetical statement here, pornographic not because of sexuality, but because of dehumanization, which really speaks to, I think, the unspoken subtext of many people's issue with pornography, right? Because pornography is the reduction of a person to an object of someone else's desire and satisfaction. Okay, so the student has done a pretty good job of expanding on Kilborn's idea and explaining to the reader why this information is in here, right? So we figured out the translation piece. So we have an example, Kilborn's original quote. We have now translated it for our reader. This is what it means that there's an issue where we turn people into objects and then give objects some sort of sexual quality, right? Which is pornographic in Kilborn's terms and in this author's estimation. So the next step is then to synthesize. In other words, how does this example and this translation support the original assertion? So let's take a look at that. This author chooses to use an example or an anecdote, if you will, to further develop the argument and to show how these two things fit together. So they state, we see this, quote, erotic charge that Kilborn mentions, especially in food commercials where food is described in sexual terms. In a Carl's Jr. ad, for example, it shows dehumanized women, but also eroticized food. Now, not so much anymore, but for a long time, Carl's Jr. was really guilty of the sort of maxim or lowest common denominator appeal to the male fantasy, right? Always pretty girls in bikinis, eating oversized cheeseburgers, and really creating this idea of eroticized food. Perhaps the most famous example might be actually the Kim Kardashian advertisement when Carl's Jr. started selling salads, right? She's rolling around on a bed, there's a salad, and she's making all these very sexual noises. And the point is that we're supposed to be transferring sexual desire from Kardashian to the salad, right? Because that's where her attention is in terms of sexual satisfaction, is on the food. And they always show these really skinny women, the Paris Hilton car washing ad, any other number of bikini-clad women eating oversized cheeseburgers, whoever's the it girl of the moment, sort of being in a Carl's Jr. commercial. Always highly sexualized, but again, transferring the sexual desire from the woman to the food. In other words, the woman is a prop. She's really just there to hold the cheeseburger and make the cheeseburger seem more appealing. And that's what this author is getting at in their paragraph, right? Which is, again, building on Kilborn's idea of this problem of sexualizing a product. Now, the only thing that's missing from this example is, of course, the connection. Answering the larger so what question. These are really good points. These are good observations. And now that we're applying the translate and the synthesize, we have a better idea of how this author is approaching their particular assertion, which is, food commercials or commercials in general are sort of pornographic in nature. But we still don't quite understand how this fits into a larger issue, right? Like, why are we even talking about this is, I guess, a good way of putting it. So we need to get to the connection piece of translate, synthesize, and connect. And here we have, when we see food as something that is sexual, it contributes to an atmosphere of emotional disconnection. Advertising simultaneously teaches people to be dissatisfied with their bodies, but also teaches them to feed that dissatisfaction with the sexualized pleasure of food. So this is really interesting. So now we get to the so what question. Why does it matter that food commercials and advertising are pornographic in nature? Why is it important that we address the issue of sex sells, right? Because it's a really popular aphorism. You hear it all the time. Sex sells, sex sells, sex sells. We see it in print advertising. We see it on TV. We see it in YouTube breaks, now that they're advertising once every 17 seconds. Like, it's everywhere, right? So the question is, it must be effective because it works. We have an aphorism that says sex sells, so we know that it works as sort of like a cultural idea. But what this author is trying to do is trying to deconstruct how that sex sells, how that idea functions, right? What is it about having these very pornographic commercials sells the product? And this last statement here, the connection piece, kind of drives the idea home, right? That it's a disassociation, that it's moving it's moving the object desire from a person to a thing. And a thing really can't satisfy our needs, right? There's no human connection there. It's a temporary fix. It is a panacea, if you will. And so that's the problem, right? That keeps us hungry for more. That keeps us coming back. It's why people have really unhealthy relationships with food, is because through advertising and through social media and through just societal issues in general, we are a culture that is obsessed with youth and thinness. And if you're neither of those things, there's a tendency to overcompensate in some way. And for the thinness aspect, it tends to be with food. There's also another sort of aspect that isn't addressed in this particular paragraph, and then I'll sort of get back to the literature and writing thing, is being a thin, obsessed culture, but then seeing thin women eat cheeseburgers, we disassociate the food with the repercussions or the outcomes, right? We don't associate that double-decker, double Western cheeseburger with obesity, and really those two things are connected, right? So something to think about. Getting back to the example, the author in this case has now used translate, synthesize, and connect. They've translated Kilbourn's original quote. They've synthesized the idea. They've connected her quote with their assertion through this anecdotal evidence of the Carl's Jr. advertisement, and then they've connected it to a larger social concern. Why should we care about this assertion? Well, it's because it has an immediate effect on how we perceive ourselves and then how we deal with emotional issues with regards to food and self-worth. Okay? So let's bring it all back together. Now that we've got our translation, our synthesis, and our connection, how does the final paragraph read? And it goes like this. Sex is one of the most prominent features in today's advertisements. Even when it comes to selling items like food or candy, advertising has become little more than pornographic scenes in some cases and dirty jokes in others. Kilbourn emphasizes the deconstructive attitude put forth by advertising. She offers a clear explanation as to why ads can be classified as pornographic, stating, sex in advertising is pornographic because it dehumanizes and objectifies people, especially women, and because it fetishizes products, imbues them with an erotic charge. Now, Kilbourn clearly points out that not only do we see pornographic images in advertising, which are pornographic not necessarily because of sexuality, but because of the dehumanization of women, but there is a slightly more subtle aspect of sexuality and objectification. Not only are women turned into objects, but objects and products are turned into something sexual. And this is where the erotic charge that Kilbourn mentions is prominent, especially in food commercials where food is described in sexual terms. In a Carl's Jr. ad, for example, it shows dehumanized women, but also eroticized food. When we see food as something sexual, it contributes to an atmosphere of emotional disconnection. Advertising simultaneously teaches people to be dissatisfied with their bodies, but also teaches them to feed that dissatisfaction with the sexualized pleasure of food. So now we can see the whole paragraph feels so much more complete. We have an assertion that leads to a reasonable conclusion, which is why is, or answers the question rather, why is sex so prominent in advertising? And we can see that it's a deliberate choice on the part of advertisers to redirect the consumer's desire and attention away from self, away from personhood, away from human to an object. And it's through that dissatisfaction that they drive sales. Not to mention the fact that America is a largely puritanical culture. Anything to deal with sexuality or sex is taboo. And as taboo, it's titillating, it's exciting, it's the forbidden fruit, if you will. And that makes it more appealing that way, right? We kind of feel like we're getting away with something. We're sort of that little thrill of excitement of flirting with danger. Something else I want to point out here is sometimes students really struggle with page count with their essays. They come to me and say, Mr. Grazier, I'm only like 3 pages in. I've kind of run out of things to say. I've used all my resources. I've used my 4, secondary sources, and I'm a page and a half short. What do I do? And then I go back in, I start looking at their essay, and I see a lot of examples or a lot of paragraphs that look like the white text in this particular example. In other words, they have an assertion and they have an example, and then they just stop there. Occasionally there'll be an additional sentence where they're trying to maybe explain why they included the example. But for the most part, they just do the assertion and the example. And because they feel that the connection between those two things are self-evident, because it was self-evident to them, it was obvious to them, they fail to make the connection or explain the connection to their reader. And then they also neglect giving us the answer to that so what question. Why is this assertion or observation relevant and important to the overall argument? Look at this paragraph. It's twice as long as the original version, right? We've added so much more to this, and it didn't take very long, and it didn't take any additional work. It's really just taking the time, and that's the thing I want to point out. It's really just about taking the time to make sure that you explain yourself clearly. Again, don't assume. There's a propensity when you're in a hurry to just assume that the other people get it, to assume that your audience is already familiar and that you don't need to do this additional bit of work. They'll just get it. And sometimes it's learnable. It's knowable. It's knowable is a better way of putting it. For the reader, sometimes it is knowable why you included a particular quote with a particular assertion, but you're making your reader do all of the heavy lifting. And that's not how you do an effective argument. If your reader has to do all the heavy lifting, they're either going to check out, or there's a really good chance they misinterpret your original argument and maybe come to a conclusion other than the one that you desired. So think about it. Explain yourself clearly. Even if you think your audience has a passing familiarity, there we go, with the subject, it's worth taking the time to explain yourself. It's a little bit better to be a little over detailed, maybe over explained, than it is to do the opposite, which is to under explain. Okay, now if we were doing this a face-to-face class, we would have a workshop where we would practice TSC a little bit. Obviously, we're not face-to-face. I can't make you do this, but I do want you to think about the TSC method as you are practicing your own writing. If you're using Axes, that's a great place to start. Use TSC to think about, are you doing the best you can with the examples and the explanation and the significance, right? That's really where TSC comes in. It really helps support Axes in that translate, synthesize, connect. In other words, explaining your example and then telling your reader why it is significant or important to your overall argument. All right, great. That's pretty much going to do it for this particular lecture. The PowerPoint slides for this lecture are available on our LMS. And if you want to open them and download them, there are some additional examples of student writing in here that show the TSC method at work with a couple of other subjects, so that maybe you can read through those and get a better sense of how the whole process works. And as always, if you have any questions about this or any other topic, you feel free to stop by our Q&A forums, send me an email, or visit during my virtual service hours on Tuesdays and Fridays from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. All right, that'll do it for me. You all have a good week, and we'll see you in the forums.